Beijing is responding furiously to President Trump signing two bills that inject the U.S. directly into the Hong Kong crisis and into China's internal affairs. How will it damage Sino-U.S. relations? Meanwhile, those bills have spawned another round of negative Western media coverage of China, a pattern that seems endless to many Chinese and on many fronts. Is it just a coincidence or part of a coordinated campaign? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Zhong Shi, sitting in for Liu Xing. U.S. intervention in the Hong Kong crisis is now official and tangible. For months, Beijing has accused Washington of interfering in its internal affairs, whether overtly through public statements or covertly through its, quote, black hands. Even as the so-called Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act found approval in Congress, it was just still words. But on Wednesday, once President Trump signed two Hong Kong-related bills into law, the U.S. formally entered the crisis and sparked outrage from China. What drove Trump to do it, and how might this impact Hong Kong specifically and China overall? And as Trump linked it to trade tensions, how could it affect the entire Sino-U.S. relationship? Joining the discussion from Hong Kong, Lawrence Ma, a barrister and chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. And in our Beijing studio, Qinduo, a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution, and Wang Cong, a reporter with the Global Times newspaper. Gentlemen, I'm happy to have all three of you joining me in our discussion today. Mr. Ma in Hong Kong, let me start with you. Regarding Hong Kong, the U.S. has long been interfering in China's domestic affairs, but U.S. officials and lawmakers say they were merely backing the principles of democracy and human rights. These two bills we're talking about today call for action, though, and part of the action is sanctions against officials accused of human rights violations. So my first question to you, does the United States have any legal rights or legal grounds to impose sanctions there?
Well, the United States is in blatant contravention with a United Nations Resolution 2131, which requires states not to, there's a principle of non-intervention which requires the member states not to intervene by economic or political means of the internal affairs of the other states. So this is a clear, blatant violation. Now, the Hong Kong citizens do not, America doesn't really care, honestly, about any Hong Kong residents being extradited in China. It is not of American interest of the livelihood or democracy of Hong Kong people. It is not their citizen. What the American is interested in is to use Hong Kong as a pawn to undermine Chinese rule, undermine the rule of Hong Kong government and the central government.
This will no doubt have an impact on so many levels and so many fronts in Hong Kong. Mr. Xu, will this light a fire under the current situation in Hong Kong? I mean, we've just had a relatively peaceful district council election. The situation at the Polytech University is finally calming down, and now this. What will be the impact, in your opinion?
Well, if you look at the timing of the bill, including the passage of the bill in the U.S. Congress, remember it was rushed through the two chambers of the U.S. Congress at a time when the riot, let's say, was actually their momentum was going down because Hong Kong police has taken this effective control of the situation, bringing back order, the rule of law. And then that moment, and the U.S. Congress passed a bill basically to say, to boost the morale of the rioters, of the even criminals and
You're
the
saying
violent
it was
protesters.
Deliberate.
That was meant to be so, and then the signing of the law make it to law, and again that will play the similar role, encouraging those rioters, encouraging those protesters to say, hey, what you have done is right, even the violence that's justifiable, that's legitimate. If you like, you can continue. So this creates such a bad situation in Hong Kong that, I mean, could happen. Even, I mean, worse situation could happen, right? Or even violence could continue. Who knows? So that's at least the temporary outcome because of the bill.
Mr. Wang, you've been reporting there on the grounds in Hong Kong. Will this embolden the protesters, especially those that are extremely violent and radical.
Yeah, I think, from the start we have been saying that, the United States and the politicians there have been, calling for the, the support for democracy where we see is nothing about the principles of a democracy. So now this bill, like you said, and, from the outset, that they are officially now saying that we are going to interfere with Hong Kong affairs. However, I want to take a little bit different approach here because we have said about how this is, abnormal, this is violation of the United Nations, articles, but from a more economic approach. Because I think, like Mr. Xu said, they rushed through this bill. So clearly, the people, at the U.S. Congress, they didn't study how this would affect not only Hong Kong or China, as the bill was aimed at, but how this would affect their businesses, their interests, and their allies' interests in Hong Kong. Because remember, Hong Kong is a financial hub, a global financial hub. It is part of China, and nothing, this bill or anything else, what they do, they will not change that status, that Hong Kong is part of that. But what this bill does is create a uncertainty for the business environment there. So that uncertainty doesn't not only affect mainland economy, the economy in Hong Kong, but many interests from the U.S. too. The U.S. last year ran a trade surplus of 33 billion, and they have 85 billion foreign direct investment in Hong Kong. The EU, all these major economies have huge interest in there. So in passing this, I don't think they will thought, even if this was a goal, a strategy to contain China, to solve chaos in Hong Kong. They didn't think it clearly.
Mr. Ma, do you agree that the timing of this bill, now a law, is interesting and tied with the situation there in Hong Kong?
Well, I think this is a great move, politically, of the Americans to unite the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to give them a target, giving them China as a target so that they would unite and they would not think about their inter-party differences, and they would continue to support President Trump. And he wanted to get elected. I think this is using Hong Kong and China as the scapegoat for their failure, and then to target China in the trade war and use Hong Kong as a base to destabilize Chinese rule is really their political plot. I think this is abhorring.
Mr. Ma, I want to talk to you about how President Trump came to this decision, because it cannot have been an easy one to make. He'd have two things on his mind. One, if he had used his veto, the bill would have gone back to House and Senate, which could easily override it with a majority vote, given the overwhelming support there in both chambers. And two, he wouldn't want to sabotage the Phase 1 trade deal that the two sides have worked so hard on and are so close to signing. What do you think went into his decision-making process there?
Well, I think it is really some of the senators, like Marco Rubio, have instigated this bill and have pushed it through Congress. I mean, this is really, he is a really anti-communist, anti-Chinese congressman. I think the political tie in America is really to find China as the scapegoat and then to target it so that they would not have any difference between themselves, and they would unite the political atmosphere in America so that they would have a similar front to fight for, like a war.
I saw you, Mr. Xu, nodding head when Mr. Ma was talking about using China as a scapegoat, talking about the timing here. As Donald Trump heads into 2020, he has a lot of balances to make, especially when it comes to China, because so much is at stake here and so much could be lost overnight. What do you think about his decision and what went into that decision-making process? What were the factors?
I think it's probably is not an easy decision for Donald Trump to make, because he has to balance. On one hand, he's in the negotiation with the Chinese side to reach a so-called phase one deal on trade issues. On the other hand, he has all the support of the bill from the senators and the congressperson, either Democrats or Republicans. Basically, it's impossible for him to veto, because that will be overridden, and then that will be a loss of face for him. So of course, once signed it into law, he would face another situation, that is the Chinese strong response from because of the intervention in the internal affairs. China will respond, at least in terms of this foreign policy, and probably could be substantially in the future. We don't know. Of course, right now you can say it's a symbolic, it's a gesture, right? It's because it's not put in practice. Even for the U.S., if it's put into practice, it could be over for Hong Kong to keep its special status, because part of the bill is like to rob Hong Kong of its special status. So once the U.S. use the bill, put it into practice, probably that's only for once, and then they will lose this card, this bargain against China. So I totally agree with Wang Cong. I don't think they have thought through about this bill in the Congress. So those Congress people, they are very ideological, basically dealing with Chinese relationship based on their ideological belief instead of basing facts and the truth. Even in Hong Kong, they call it human rights and democracy. If you look at Hong Kong, especially the election just concluding in Hong Kong. So where is the Chinese interference, the central government or from the Chinese mainland? No interference at all, and everybody was accessing their rights and their democracy. So, and also this is I think a signal for these protesters, especially those violent protesters. There is a correct way to exercise your rights of freedom and democracy. That is to go to the voting station over there instead of creating trouble on the street. But the U.S., it's like being bland. Still, they choose to side with those violent protesters. That's really unacceptable.
Mr. Wong, what do you think? Is the trade deal a big decision-making factor for Trump? Will that process be disrupted now that we have this new law?
I think for the timing of Trump's signing of this this act into law is also very interesting. It shows that the Trump administration knows that they expect the furious response from China, because they announced it on Wednesday after the market closed, and then before the Thanksgiving holiday, where the stock markets were to be closed. Because if he signed that during a market session, that would definitely, the U.S. stock market would tank, because everybody knows the timing. It's very sensitive and delicate with regards to the trade negotiations. So then, if he announced such a make such an announcement, it would definitely have some impact on the trade deal. But with regard to how we go forward, should we separate the two issues, or put in one case? That's still remain to be seen.
We'll wait to find out. I want to have all three of you look at this. My colleague Liu Xin has been talking to people on the streets in Hong Kong to get their reaction to the signing of the bill. Take a look.
Concerning the human rights.
It's ridiculous, I think.
Why?
Because I believe the Americans are behind the protests. I think they're funding the protests here, so I think he's created the problem.
How long have you lived in Hong Kong?
28 years.
28 years, and you live here with your family?
Yes.
And do you work in the financial business sector?
Yes.
Will your business be affected by this?
Everybody's business is affected by it.
What kind of effects are you expecting?
I think that it's affecting Hong Kong's ability to trade as an independent financial centre. So, who knows? But I think it's a good thing.
What are you going to do then, if now that this bill is signed into law? Is there anything that people like you can do to help Hong Kong stay, the kind of special advantages in terms of trade and financial transactions?
Well, I think Hong Kong people have always adapted, so one will hope that they will work out a way to adapt to these problems like they've adapted to other changes in the past. But I think that no one knows what the effect will be yet, so we have to wait and see.
Yeah. What do you think this bill will do to the social polarization of Hong Kong? I mean, we just had this district election.
It's definitely not going to help. I think Hong Kong needs to heal. I think both sides need to listen to each other and learn from what's happened. I think there's been a problem with perception bias in Hong Kong, in that the protesters don't understand what the people who disagree with them feel, and those people who disagree with the protest don't understand where the protest is coming from and why they feel so strongly about the things that they're protesting about. So I think there's been a big disconnect in Hong Kong, and both sides need to listen to the other side, otherwise we're never going to heal.
Yeah, and with this bill, does it make it better, easier for them to listen to each other?
Of course not. I don't think so. I don't see how this helps one little bit.
What about the trade war? I mean, the trade frictions, let's say, between China.
Personally, I see this as part of the trade war. I think that the protesters have got their concerns, but I think that that has been fueled and paid for by American money. And so I think this is part of the trade war, in a certain sense. I really believe America must have some role in funding this.
Where are you from originally? The UK?
The UK, yes.
Okay. But how would you describe, because you lived here 28 years, so you saw the end of the British rule and you saw all the 22 years after Hong Kong came over to China. How would you describe the two different eras?
I think that the big difference, in my opinion, is mobile phones and people like yourself who are presenting news on real time. So under the British rule, things were not perfect by a long way, but problems were not so instantly brought to the media's attention, the world's attention. But now everyone's got a phone, everyone films everything, so instantly anything happens, everyone knows about it. I think that's been the big difference, not just in Hong Kong, but around the world, in how people look at things. So in Hong Kong, under the British, there was no democracy. They only introduced it very late in the day, before the handover. I think Hong Kong has got more democracy today than it's ever had in the past. For sure, it's not the full democracy that people want and expect, but it's better than it was. So when people look back to the British rule and as some sort of glory period, I think that's wrong. I think that Hong Kong is still the freest economy in the world. It's still economically very strong. Okay, it's taken a dip. So actually I think things have been pretty good. You'd have to look at Hong Kong as a big success story. And I think after the Chinese takeover, I personally think that Beijing has been very good in letting Hong Kong get on with doing what it does. To my mind, it hasn't interfered. I think that all the problems have been because of mismanagement in Hong Kong. I don't think it's the problem of across the border.
Yeah.
So I think this is a mess that Hong Kong people have created, and Hong Kong people need to fix it.
Do you mind that we use your name? Do you mind giving your identity, or do you want to keep it anonymous? We're from CGTN, the International TV of China.
Oh, okay.
Do you mind, or you want to keep it anonymous?
You can use. I think you can use my name. My name's John Maguire. I don't think I've said anything too bad. Maybe some people won't like it, but that's life. We're all entitled. I think one of the freedoms that we have in Hong Kong is we all should have the freedom to express our own opinions. And obviously some people don't feel that way at the moment, but
and you have the freedom to express your opinion.
Absolutely. I think Hong Kong has got a lot of freedoms. We do have the freedom to speak up. We do have the freedom to disagree. We do have the freedom to call out a government when it gets things wrong. And I think these are things which should be in Hong Kong, should be cherished. And at the moment they're being trampled on, I think.
Thank you so much. I wish you have a good day.
Gentlemen, we've heard from that man there on the street talking to our Liu Xi. We've also heard from the SAR government in Hong Kong voicing its opposition to President Trump signing the bill into law. And we've also heard from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, who says there will be consequences. Mr. Xi, what do you think will be China's reaction?
Well, for now, I think mostly will be as a diplomatic action. I think like a protest, including the calling of the U.S. ambassador to China, etc. But also remember, on the U.S. side, it's right now, if you don't put the practice, the policy into practice, it's still a gesture. It's still symbolic, like the symbolic intervention of Hong Kong. But of course, morally, they give the boost of it emboldens the protesters. So that's very bad, I would say, very negative consequence or rule from the U.S. bill. But if the U.S. choose to put it into practice, on one hand, it will hurt their own interests. On the other hand, not China will suffer, it's Hong Kong. Hong Kong people will suffer the most. So that's why sometimes I find it very hard to understand, for example, some of the pandemic activists, including Joshua Wong, who has been advocating for 5 years for this bill, but it will only hurt the interests of Hong Kong. Why are you doing that? So this is hard to understand. And of course, if the U.S., as I said, if the U.S. put it into practice, and their card will be gone.
All right.
And yeah.
Mr. Wong, what do you think?
I think, like Mr. Xu said, this is basically just a law now. What it does, because President Trump in the statement, he's also very ambiguous about what he was doing, because he kind of saying that we're disagreeing with provisions of the act, the first act about the review of the annual review, and he said that we might treat these provisions a little bit differently. So that kind of leaves some room for maneuver. So then it depends on how the overall relationship between China-U.S. going, and which is kind of now the trade negotiations. So now they're kind of saying that this is kind of part of the trading negotiations, but from the Chinese side, that's not negotiable, because that's internal affairs. That's much more important than the trade negotiations itself. So in the immediate, I think immediately we would draw up some list. They want to sanction people who they deem to violate human rights.
Okay.
We can also draw up some list of people who we think interfere with Hong Kong affairs, with China's interfere.
A reciprocal.
So we should have also come up with a mechanism, a response, in essence, that kind of a response, like a tit-for-tat response, and we can just prepare for that. If they do actually put this into law action, then we have something to respond with.
We'll keep a close eye on that. And this is The Point on CGTN. Do stay with us right here. Also on our broadcast today, the two Hong Kong-related bills signed by President Trump represent more than a direct intrusion into China's internal affairs. To many Chinese, it's the latest in a series of Western actions, especially by Western media, that paints China in a most negative light, from portraying the Hong Kong crisis as a battle for human rights to accusing China of widespread abuses in Xinjiang, to branding Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant, as a, quote, threat to national security. Is this drumbeat of critical coverage purely a coincidence, or something of a coordinated campaign of soft power warfare aimed to damage China's reputation in the eyes of the world? My conversation with my three guests continues on The Point today. Mr. Xu, you are a seasoned media professional, so this has come up in your line of work frequently. Western media's criticism of China is nothing new, but in the recent months, it just seems more and relentless. What is fueling, in a lot of people's eyes, this smear on China?
Well, you can see if you listen to the speeches made by the U.S. top officials, including Secretary of State Pompeo and their National Security Advisor O'Brien recently, for example, in terms of Huawei technology, in terms of the One Belt, One Road initiative there, you can see this is it's bad-mouthing. For me, I have been observing the China-U.S. relationship for years, and I've never seen any officials would do something like this. There's no bottom line. The language they use is unacceptable, is unfair, is rarely seen, I would say, in the history of diplomacy. So I think there's consensus in the U.S., a lead group of people in Washington, in particular, facing the rise of China, China, they will do whatever it takes to contain the rise of China, to badmouth China, to slander China, to basically, sabotage the rise of China, the image of China. And their media, I think their media obviously pick up the cue, and they will do correspondingly. So they will cover a lot of stories about China being bad, so casting an international image very negatively.
Mr. Wang, do you think the root cause of all of this is about to contain the rise of China? I mean, how do you do that with negative media reports? What does it achieve?
I think, at first I want to say, like you said, we have been talking about how foreign media, specifically Western media, have been reporting on China so negatively, and ideologically biased. But in probably last 2 weeks, they have shown completely that they have lost any, standards, any principle, any journalistic codes in appeasing to their audience or their officials back home.
Are you talking about their reports of Hong Kong?
That's right. So no, not Hong Kong. Hong Kong is one, but the Australian case. A 28 guy went there and said, "I'm a spy from China," and all the Western media jumped on it without any confirmation, without any checkup. So that kind of shows that they are, hungry. They are, they're looking for these kind of stories to just, demonize China, to badmouth China. So it's kind of, a serious escalation, from the before. It was negative, reports. We get it, that's how they operate. But from that to, to just demonize the subject, which is China, and ignore all the principles. That's just completely, absolutely, unacceptable. And it's okay because, like you said, where's the root cause? That's what we're trying to figure out in the U.S. That's based on the rise of the anti-China, sentiments, fueled by nothing but ideological, ideological bias. Because before, the reports, they're mostly, you can call them, more biased towards sensationalism, in Hong Kong, and towards laziness. Because they don't get it, but now it's more ideological, which is dangerous. Because what happens after you continue to their propaganda, about China, this could create a public opinion, negative public opinion back home, and that kind of forms up the policy, and that's where the danger can happen.
Okay, Mr. Ma, are you hearing this in your observation? Have you noticed an escalation in the negative reports of China and in a smear campaign about China, as my two other guests have pointed out?
Yes, I think Americans are very hypocritical. Now, today is the Thanksgiving Day, and Thanksgiving Day is to thank, the origin of it is for the pilgrims, for the Caucasian pilgrims who escaped Britain and went to America and was hosted and was given food and shelter by Red Indians. But in fact, there was a massacre of the Red Indians because they didn't come to an agreement with the American rules. So, I mean, if the Americans were to accuse the Chinese government of having any tight control of people in Xinjiang, they should look back into their history, the American black history of the Thanksgiving Day, for killing all the Indians and to rule America. This is highly and so outrageously hypocritical for them.
Mr. Ma, I'm going to leave you there, and to thank you to our other guests here in the Beijing studio. I'm afraid that's all the time we have, and that is all from this edition of The Point. And as always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX, and download the CGTN app to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thank you for watching. You've got The Point.